Okay, you can cut your microphones if you're listening to something else. Um, who do we have? I think we have our audience. Oh, Zumretay.
Hi, hi guys.
He's here, one of our presenters today. Welcome, welcome. Nice
Thank
to
you.
meet you. We also have, is Gilbert around?
Yep, Gilbert's here.
Where's Gilbert?
Hello, hello.
There you go. There you go.
Hey, Gilbert.
Oh, well done, well done. Hi. So Gilbert Andres is our other presenter today. And our very own Carlo Almendral will be taking on the third presentation as well now for our episode tonight on surveillance, AI, ethics in the Philippines. Well, actually, not just in the Philippines, no, since we're lucky enough to have Zumretay Arkin on board to talk about surveillance. Well, outside of the country. She's a guest from Munich, and she'll be talking about surveillance in the People's Republic of China and the Uyghur Muslim minority in the west of China. We also have Gilbert Andres, who's a lawyer in the fields of the Constitution and human rights and other things, of course. But he's on board mainly to talk about the writ of Habeas Data, one of our protective writs in Philippine law, and a very interesting development on how we talk about state surveillance and the dossiers that we keep on enemies of the state or threats to national security. And then our last presentation will be by Carlo on surveillance and AI in general. Should we just jump right in, guys?
Sure.
And Doc, so tonight's format will be a little different, no? Instead of the usual presentations in sequence, although we will be doing that sort of. Tonight will be a little more conversational. I'm quite happy to see a smaller crowd for once. I feel free already to just say whatever I want to say. Carlo usually has jokes every half sentence, and he's been awfully quiet on the microphone for the past 2 episodes. So looking forward to something happier tonight, although the topic will be deathly serious. And Doc will be taking the back seat today, but of course, Doc, we always count on you to weigh in, chime in, and give us your courtside opinion on things, whatever the topic is now. So let's kick things off with a presentation from Munich, from Zumretay Arkin. Hi, Zumretay.
Hi, thank you, Nick, for the introduction, and thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here. So maybe just a quick intro. So my name is Zumretay, like Nick mentioned. I work for the World Uyghur Congress as the Program and Advocacy Manager, which our organization is an international organization that represents the Uyghur people outside and inside the region, East Turkestan, also known as the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region of China. I am myself Uyghur, and so yeah, I work at this NGO. I don't know how familiar everyone is with the Uyghurs or the plight of Uyghurs, so I thought I would just like kind of give the general picture. So the Uyghur people, they're ethnically Turkic, mainly living in East Turkestan. The Uyghur people, we call it East Turkestan because the term Xinjiang is in Chinese translates to new border, and for us it's a sign, it's just a remembrance of the colonization that happened in 1949. When the Chinese army walked inside the region, just like Tibet. So the Uyghurs have actually they have their own unique language, culture, history. They're mostly Sunni Muslims, and the population inside is approximately 11.6 million, according to Chinese official statistics. But the Uyghur activists around the world think it's around 20 to 25 million inside. And then there's 1 million of us living in the diaspora.
Yes.
So geographically, we're situated in the northwest western part of China, just above Tibet, and actually between Tibet and Inner Mongolia. So
Okay.
it's like 1/6 of the of Chinese geography. So
Maybe for
we
reference, Zumretay, we can flash your slide presentation on this, the geography of East
yeah,
Turkestan. Carlo, you might have to switch out the share screen. And Zumretay, would you like to be the one to share the screen?
yes, sure. There you go. So actually, the region borders with 8 different countries. As you can see here, this is the blue part is the Uyghur region. Current situation maybe why is the Uyghur cause relevant at the moment? It's because Uyghurs actually have been persecuted by the Chinese government for a lot of their modern history, but since Xi Jinping came to power, it kind of deteriorated incredibly because of the continuous crackdown on their freedoms, such as freedom of religion, freedom of movement, expression, opinion. So all these freedoms have been curtailed in the region, and Uyghur people have been targeted as we're like a minority inside China. And obviously, we're Muslims, and after 9/11, they kind of used the war on terror as a pretext to even emphasize their crackdown. And the Chinese government have tried to forcibly assimilate and socially re-engineer Uyghur people by trying to erode their identity and everything that makes the Uyghur people unique, as like their history, culture, language, have been targeted. And in April 2017, there was they were like reports and emerging that there was these internment camps being built inside the region. And so right as of now, we have between 1.8 to 3 million of Uyghurs sent to internment camps, which are similar to concentration camps, just because for various reasons and arbitrary reasons as well. And
wow, we were just talking about the jail population here in the Philippines right before you came into the podcast. And what was the estimate, Carlo? 250,000?
15,000, yeah.
250,000
yeah.
people in jail in the Philippines. And Zumretay, you're telling us that there are about 1.8 to 3 million Uyghurs in internment camps, right?
Exactly. So according to reports by many scholars, many researchers, and who actually used numbers that were displayed from official documents that comes from China, these were the numbers, and the UN actually used this in 2018 too, saying over 1 million of Uyghurs were imprisoned in these internment camps. And actually, the first kind of evidence we had were satellite imagery, were reporters going to these camps. But recently in November, we started having official documents. There were some leaks that came out, and those leaks were official Communist Party documents that were leaked with the help of whistleblowers. So the first one came in November and published by the New York Times, that published that it was about like the 403 pages of internal documents. And then the second leak came a week after this one, and that was reported by the International Investigative Consortium of Journalists. And then this third one is actually the recent one in February that came out, is the Karakash list documents, which all these 3 leaks combined together, they kind of gave us the confirmation of all of our suspicions and all of the previous reportings that were made, and confirmed that all these people that were detained were mostly detained on vague and arbitrary decisions. So the latest leak indicate that if people could be detained just for having families abroad. So if you were an Uyghur living in the Uyghur region and you had connections abroad, that was one good reason for you to be detained in these camps. If men were growing beards, that was another good reason. And then women wearing the veil, that was another reason. Women carrying more than 4 child, having more than 4 child, and just like really, dubious and vague reasons were actually good reasons for you to be interned. So this is why at the moment this matters, because it's a crime against humanity. It's a very grave concern from the international community as well. The UN has raised this issue many times, and I was actually at the Human Rights Council session this February and March, and I raised the issue along with other states. And up to now, China has been response was, it changed over the years, but the first response was they denied the existence of these camps. Then they went saying that these were vocational training camps meant to re-educate people and fight against terrorism and extremism. And their narratives changed a couple of times throughout the years. Yeah.
Can I ask you a question? I don't think your people's plight has been covered well in the Philippines. Can you go into the extent of which the retraining is happening for the Uyghurs in East Turkestan? Because I think the extremity of it is also very alarming, right? It's not just that they're putting them into internment camps. It's also what they're doing to people once they're there.
Of course. So we had a couple of testimonies from former detainees themselves who managed to escape, who were actually released by China, and then because they had other citizenships, so they were released, and then they went back to their respective countries, and then they started talking about their experience. And I've actually interviewed one of the detainees, former detainees, last, I think in January, and the situation in these camps are very, very bad. Not only like in one room, there's approximately 30 to 40 people easily. So these rooms are crowded, and it's the sanitation, the hygiene are very poor, and their daily routine resembles to like it's basically like a prison, It's not even open air. It's these actually people are incarcerated innocently, and they go through this re-engineering and like propaganda kind of toward
reprogramming, right?
Yeah, exactly. So they're every day, before every meal, they have to sing the Chinese national anthem. They have to praise the Communist Party and Xi Jinping especially, and they have to watch videos of him and like his speeches, and they kind of pledge allegiance to the Communist Party and saying that they're living great lives thanks to the Communist Party. And so they really go through these, and it's not on a voluntary basis that they go to these camps. They are actually sent. So the voluntary base of that is absolutely false. And actually, a lot of these detainees are intellectuals. We were intellectuals, scholars, artists. These people don't need re-education. If it was really re-education, they don't need that, because these people were among the elite of the Uyghur population. Why would they need re-education, And they also learn, they're forced to learn Chinese language, and they're forced to abandon all kinds of religious practices inside. This also applies outside of the camps as well. But inside the camps, this was their daily routine. They would learn Mandarin. They were banned from speaking Uyghur language. They were banned from showing any kind of religious signs or anything. So it's, their freedom is very curtailed and controlled inside.
I have a quick question, Zumretay.
Yes.
If I searched Google for photos of the Uyghur re-education camps now, these are, would you say these are legitimate photos? Like,
So
fake
there
news?
were there were actually some photos that were published, and they were by the Chinese officials, well, like by Chinese authorities, and that we kind of retrieved from that, so internal sources. There's one very famous one where all the prisoners were kind of rounded up outside of the camps, and they were all wearing blue. I actually should have put the image here.
That's on the wiki of.
Yes. So this one is the genuine photo, and actually Radio Free Asia was able to identify some of the detainees who were seen on the picture. And some of them were professors or scholars, or just like your normal guy. And some of them, yeah, like there are a couple of photos that emerged from the region because foreign journalists, reporters went, and they were actually some of them were able to go in, but some of them went and they were invited for propaganda tours. So China actually kind of does these propaganda tours for foreigners, where they take them into these camps that kind of like show them that these people are here voluntarily and they're doing great stuff, and they're, China is educating them and giving them opportunities for later. But these are propaganda tours, and like the real concentration camps are very, like, it's very difficult to get access to them and get like a genuine information. But there were some reporters who managed to go. So this is where it comes, but we don't have so many photos, I would say. Yes.
I see a slide here on your presentation about the surveillance system. You think we can, or
yes,
are we jumping too far ahead already? Is this?
No. It was my next point. So I'm just gonna start with the surveillance. So ever since China, like with China's, ever since its inception, China has been systematically surveying all of its citizens, but they also like installed video surveillances in public places, including facial recognition. And now I think in early 2000s, with the intelligence-led policing measures, that kind of really kicked off the whole surveillance state. And in 2014, the government started this Strike Hard campaign against violent activities and terrorism in Xinjiang particularly. And in 2016, they appointed Chen Zhongguo, which was the Communist Party secretary in Tibet previously, who was actually very well known in Tibet for introducing harsh surveillance methods. And so with his appointment in East Turkestan in 2016, he kind of implemented new measures that were actually used in Tibet. And he, transformed the region into a total police surveillance. And with his administration, they established around 7,500 convenience police stations and introduced facial recognition technology in public spaces throughout the region of Xinjiang, GPS tracking of vehicles and spyware on Uyghur smartphones. And they also established checkpoints, police checkpoints, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. So
I have a question first on Operation Golden Shield. Was it that you didn't say out loud, but it's up there on your notes?
Yes.
Right, Golden Shield project, that is. And in the early 2000s, it sounds like there was a shift in the way that the PRC had been collecting data. Very similar to the Philippines, there was a shift in the 2000s also, but it was targeted more against alleged allies of the communist movement, insurgent movement here in the Philippines. And of course, I know that even if it was a targeted effort to collect personal information about insurgents. It was still very much analog back in the 2000s. A lot of it was just, you know, maybe typed into a Word document or printed out in PDFs, right? What was it like in the early 2000s? Because if China has this long history of surveillance and surveilling its own people, was there any technological leap in the 2000s? Something well before GPS tracking and facial recognition, which I can see here is already in the second decade of this century now.
Mm-hmm. To be honest, like I didn't do so much research on the Golden Shield project, so I wouldn't be able to tell you in details what it entails. But I know that it was obviously one of the leading projects, and that kind of initiated the whole surveillance state. But it was basically like a nationwide network with fundamental constructional projects that that China did. And then I think in the early 2000s, yeah, it was pretty difficult to do any kind of technological implement technological measures. But I think it was like one of like the waking of the strategy of implementing it as like the technologies develop, obviously with later the years. But I think the turning point for the Uyghur region was really after 9/11, and then I think 2009, because 2009 and during July was the Urumqi Uprising. I was actually I was there.
Sorry,
And
can you tell us what that is? Can you explain to the audience?
Yes, the Urumqi Uprising started on July 5th, 2009. It was a non-violent demonstration by Uyghurs who gathered in the capital, who were mostly young students, because there was a few days before that that started. There were some Uyghurs who were killed in a factory in a Chinese region, and because of the mounting racism and hatred between both ethnic groups. And then because of this incident, the Uyghurs in Urumqi, which is the capital of Xinjiang, they just gathered around, and they took, they marched the streets it was totally pacific movement, and they started claiming that China was, installing all these repressive policies to discriminate against Uyghurs, and they were basically being treated as second-class citizens in their own region. And this really quickly escalated into like an armed, not conflict, I wouldn't say it was a conflict, but it was the response from the Chinese government was very severe and violent. And then this kind of escalated in this uprising where, people were killed. And so this was like a really turning point for both, I think, Chinese and Uyghurs. And then the really severe crackdown on Uyghurs started after 2009.
Can you tell me a bit more about some of these photos that you have? Like maybe pick one or two. Further down, you have a lot more photos now. So
yes.
Anything here that you want to highlight? Like I see home visits and surveillance cameras everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. So as I was saying, I'll just quickly, here. So here you can see, this is from the New York Times. Some journalists from the New York Times went here, and this is Urumqi, the capital. They went and they just in that stretch of street, they counted 20 cameras, surveillance cameras that are, surrounding shops, mosques, and all kinds of public institutions. And this photo is, because of after Chen Guo, they introduced the facial recognition programs where they've implemented checkpoints at different places, so like police stations, schools, mosques, residential areas where Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities have to go through these checkpoints. And basically they use CCTV cameras, and then they collect. So they have, it's a facial recognition system, but they also collect information from their phones. And it's actually the China Electronics Technology Group Corporation that devised the three-dimensional portrait and integrated data doors. That's so this is the
same people who are making this IJOP, right?
Yeah, exactly. So some of them are actually, some of the checkpoints are before going into shops, and it's like collecting any kind of suspicious, like any information that would deem suspicious from the individual. Right. And then obviously the whole surveillance industry is, most of it is provided by Chinese companies, like the technologies, but then there are some foreign companies that are actually involved in or play a role in these repressive surveillance policies that's implemented by China. And one of them is Thermo Fisher Scientific. It's a US-based company that works on DNA sequencers. And the company actually supplied the Xinjiang police with DNA suppliers when Chinese authorities were building a large-scale infrastructure to process DNA samples of Uyghurs, and building this system to recognize Uyghur attributes. And the company, they later said, when Human Rights Watch contacted them and raised their concerns about this, they said that initially they were not aware like how China would use these DNA sequencers, but there was a little bit, I think, a little bit of naivety around this, because they assumed that like China would use it in a responsible way. But I think it's kind of naive to think that, given the authoritarianism.
Given history books, right?
Exactly.
Right.
And so other researchers and geneticists were also part of this whole plan. And so here, like, this is like the facial recognition programs that are used.
Wait, sorry, Zumretay,
yeah.
Everything you're saying is really interesting. So like, don't want to speed you up too much. What is the biggest problem with the facial recognition use of CCTV systems in the East Turkestan province?
So basically, what they do is, I'm gonna just jump to this slide. I'm not gonna read through the whole thing, but so this is called the IJOP. IJOP is the Integrated Joint Operations Platform. So this kind of gathers all kinds of information from the individuals. So they take, information ranging from blood types, height, religious affiliation, political affiliation, all kinds of these things. And then they all gather these informations in this platform and create these profiles for each individual. And they've actually came up with 36 categories that are kind of that need special attention. So on this slide, you can see like the 36 person types are listed here. But this is part of under the Strike Hard campaign that was introduced. And they, like I said, they do take DNA samples, fingerprints, iris scans, blood types of the residents in the region from age 12 to 65. And they also require residents to give voice samples when they apply for passports or renew their passports. And this all is like, all of this information is centralized on this app. And the Xinjiang police, they have this other app that kind of connects to this one, and that flags them to all the people who are being suspicious or have suspicious activities. But these are actually like very intrusive measures. And one of the, so this is like on this app, but then there's another way, you were talking about it earlier, but the intrusive home visits that were actually started in 2013, where China kind of sends Chinese officials into these families. And this campaign in 2018 called Becoming Family campaign was, it was really meant to send Chinese officials in each Uyghur family to kind of, take notes of their behaviors and like their daily life. So this is a very intrusive way of, getting to know what they're doing. And like they were these officials obviously took notes, and it was not voluntary. Like there was no indication that the Uyghur people receiving these officials for days, they had the choice to refuse their visits. So this is also another way of surveying the population, the Uyghur population in the region.
Well, aren't these people terrorists? Like, why is it bad to monitor these Muslim terrorists who stab people? Seems like the acts of terrorism kind of precipitated these monitoring behaviors, right?
Right. Like there were, so after 9/11, like I said, there was this mounting of these campaigns put in place to fight against terrorism, which is valid. But they actually introduced many laws, so counterterrorism law, de-extremification regulations.
Wait, can I respond to that? Like, what evidence did you have on that, Okombe?
On what
Well,
exactly?
Uyghurs have committed mass stabbings, right? Like Muslims are frequently a problematic population that murders innocent civilians on a large scale, and they've done it in China.
Data, please. What are you talking about?
Just Google Uyghur terrorist attacks, China.
I know.
Like,
I'm saying,
what's documentation?
What's your data on this?
There are terrorist attacks committed by Uyghurs in China. That is a public documented fact.
Okay, I get it. I get what you're saying, but you're saying like a bunch of buzzwords on this, right? Like, how big of a problem is it?
Even one is a big problem, right? And that's
Okay,
like the Chinese government is
right, but
the Chinese government wants no more terrorist attacks. If Muslims don't want to be treated like terrorists, they should stop committing terrorism. If they didn't commit terrorism, none of these measures would be in place.
Hold on. Can I set some order, Carlo? We have to go through the presentations first. So Okombe, if you don't mind, we'll keep you on mute first. And Zumretay, we have to go through your last point now and then move on to Gilbert, if you don't mind. We can go back to your other slides if you have to when we get to the Q&A portion. Okombe, if you have questions, could you please put them on the Google Doc and we'll read the questions from there. Keep it polite, keep it tight, and yeah, we'll try to get through as many questions as we can. So Zumretay, the floor is yours.
And that kind of cowardice is like why we're having these conversations, because if you actually had real things to say about this, we would listen to you. But if you don't, move on. Okay, sorry, Zumretay.
It's okay, don't worry. So, I mean, I think I kind of went through pretty much all of what I had to say, except like
interesting thing, Zumretay. Have you ever had something like this happen in the middle of a presentation?
Not me. I am like pretty familiar with these kind of things, internet trolls or people like that on the internet, but I never face it like directly because I started like in September, so it's quite new. But yeah. Okay,
well, sorry about not being able to filter people. We did keep the invitation open, but on a very short window for people. That explains why we have a very small audience today now. But yeah, apologies for that. Thankfully, Doc, you've gotten rid of him already. And if anyone wants to be adversarial or wants to ask really tough questions, you're more than welcome to. Just put them in the Google Sheet and we'll ask those questions for you later, okay? Zumretay, anything else to add and to wrap up the point?
So I think to wrap up the point is just that ever since Xi Jinping to arrive to power, like they used all kinds of techniques to repress on the Uyghur minority, and surveillance is one of them. And obviously with China wanting to become a super tech power by in the next few years, this is worrying because the Uyghurs have been like in the Uyghur region. This has been like a testing ground on like surveillance and repressive technologies, but actually this might be, you know, exported to other places with, especially with the 5G network that's now present in Europe. That's kind of worrying because there's this authoritarian regime that wants to, you know, deploy all these surveillance technologies in these regions, and they've actually done it in a couple of places, especially in Central Asia, where, you know, a lot of their cameras, high vision cameras, are everywhere in Central Asia, and in Latin American countries as well. And I think in Asia they're going to be, you know, pretty present as well. So and like the, you know, high visions, Dahua vision, all these technologies, companies have provided the surveillance cameras used in internment camps as well in the Uyghur region. And now there was also new report that came out recently about Uyghurs being transferred in labor transfer programs, where the detainees from these camps were actually released but then transferred to these forced labor facilities. And in these forced labor facilities, these repressive technology, well, these cameras from these companies were actually also used. So it's all like, you know, how do we use these technologies in a responsible way, and also stop and hold China accountable for its crimes that they're committing through these through using these technologies.
Oh, very, very, very great point on that. We'll discuss more of that, no? The latest news about these camps, no? But we have to give the floor now to Gilbert, if you don't mind, Zumretay. Thanks for that presentation. Wow, very exciting one, Carlo and Doc, no? It never happened to me before in any public event. Gilbert, you're on deck. I hope no one else will chime in and interrupt your presentation.
Good evening, everyone. I hope everyone is safe and healthy amidst the COVID situation.
Oh, thanks very much.
So I'm going to talk about habeas data. And
can you cut your presentation, please?
yes. So habeas data. So if you look at habeas data, you can actually compare it with habeas corpus, which is more familiar. And habeas corpus literally means that we command you have the body. So if someone's being illegally detained, like the Uyghurs in China, then here in the Philippines, someone who's illegally detained can actually file for habeas corpus. And the remedy is for that person to be released. So in the same way, there's habeas corpus, there's also habeas data, which literally means in Latin that we command you have the data. So if there's data on a person that's being collected, gathered, processed by state agents or even by private individuals, then
Gilbert,
that
are you sharing a screen right now? Are you sharing a presentation?
Yes, I'm showing my presentation.
Oh, we don't see it yet.
Can't see it.
Okay.
I think you have to press OK. Yeah, there you go.
And
then full screen?
Full screen. Can you see it?
Or view?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, you can keep it in that if you don't mind. If you don't mind that, go ahead.
Okay. So as I was talking earlier, habeas data is really a remedy if data is being gathered on a person. So it's being collected, anything about that person, whether it's the personal information, the family relations, correspondence, even metadata about that person. So habeas data is the remedy to stop that collection. So it's really a remedy against dossier on a person. So in fact, if you look at the rules on habeas data, it's really a remedy available to any person whose right to privacy is being violated, or there's a mere threat of violation due to an unlawful act or omission by a public official, employee, or, take note, or of a private individual. So this actually can be a remedy not just against state agents, but even against private individuals, especially if they're engaged in gathering, collecting, or storing data or information. Now, ultimately, what's the remedy if someone has filed a petition for habeas data? So the remedy really is to stop the collection of that data. So there can be a deletion of the data. The aggrieved party can also ask for state agents to actually produce the information or data that's being gathered on that person. And ultimately, the aggrieved party can ask the court to delete any dossier that state agents or even private individuals have gathered. So just to give you an example, we actually filed a petition for habeas data before the Supreme Court. And we filed it on behalf of computer experts. So these are actually members of the Automated Election System Watch. So the AS Watch members actually challenged the use of the Smartmatic PCOS machines during the 2013 elections. And they were actually arguing based on the technicalities why the Smartmatic PCOS should not have been adopted for the 2013 national elections. Now, lo and behold, at some point, a deputy spokesperson actually said in a press briefing that the office of the president actually gave 30 million pesos to the Commission on Elections. And what's the purpose of this 30 million pesos? It was actually an intelligence fund given to the Commission on Elections so that they can do some intelligence gathering against alleged election saboteurs. So referring to critical persons, technical persons critical about the Smartmatic automated election system. So the members of AS Watch filed a petition for habeas data against all the COMELEC commissioners. And so interesting, in fact, our first petitioner was no less than the former COMELEC commissioner, Gas Lagman, who's actually the only IT expert who's appointed to the COMELEC. But unfortunately, he was not confirmed by the Commission on Appointments. So he was our lead petitioner, as well as other scientists, Dr. Manalastas, Lito Averia. So the petition really wants to know what were the pieces of information, data or information that were gathered with respect to the petitioners. Because of course, if there's an intelligence fund, then it presupposes that it's being used to gather data about the critics. And ultimately, we actually asked the Supreme
Sorry, Attorney.
Yes, Carlo.
You give us an overview about the intelligence fund for everyone else, just so we're on the same page about why that's a big issue.
Yes, intelligence funds are really funds that are being used to actually finance agents, persons who will try to gather information. Essentially, it's a fund for spying.
Right. So, sorry, just to add, and correct me if I'm wrong here, part of it is that this administration has added a lot more to the intelligence fund in the past year or two, right? The other thing is that it's also not scrutinizable by Senate and Congress. Is that correct?
Okay. Actually, it should still be under the oversight of the Senate and of the House, except that it's almost unaudited because, of course, if it's intelligence funds, it's almost like a personal kitty on the part of the agency. They can use it whatever, wherever, whenever they want it.
Right.
So it's also a conduit for corruption for public officers.
Yep. Because it's unauditable.
Yes.
Right.
Because the presumption is you should not produce receipts for it so that the those CA functions will not be revealed.
Right. So, sorry, just to inject my own thoughts in this. Like in the best case scenario, they're using this for actual intelligence scenarios, right? Where they're actually using this to spend on spies so they get more information that they need, right? I don't want to say that anyone's corrupt for anything, but I think at the best case scenario, the intelligence fund, why it's increased the past couple of years, is that it's become more used for intelligence resources.
Actually, there are legitimate purposes for having intelligence funds. For example, you really want to know the situation in terms of security. But in this case, it was really directly used against so-called critical persons with respect to the Smartmatic automated election system. So our petitioners, our clients, felt that there was actually a threat to their right to privacy. In fact, there were press releases by no less than the chair of the COMELEC then, Sixto Brillantes, directed against our petitioners. So we had to file this habeas data. And we filed it before the Supreme Court because actually the Supreme Court, Court of Appeals, Regional Trial Court, they actually have concurrent jurisdiction, meaning to say you can file it, SC, CA, RTC. But we chose for strategic purposes the Supreme Court. But since there are actually factual issues and the Supreme Court is not a trier of facts, it was actually referred to the Court of Appeals. So there was actually a hearing before the Court of Appeals. So we presented our petitioners as our witnesses. We tried to present pieces of evidence that will show that our petitioners felt that there was a threat to their privacy. And then the respondents, led by the COMELEC chair then, Sixto Brillantes, also presented themselves as their own witnesses. Now, the unfortunate development is that the CA actually denied our petition for habeas data.
On what grounds?
On the ground that there was no substantial evidence. And it's so interesting. If you look at the rules on the writ of habeas data, you only need substantial evidence. And what's substantial evidence? That's really the lowest quantum of evidence. That's actually the quantum of evidence needed in a labor complaint, in an admin complaint. So just reasonable amount of evidence. As opposed
to the level of data or evidence that you need to present for a criminal case.
Yes.
So that people who aren't familiar with law would know the difference.
Yes, for criminal case, actually the most difficult quantum of evidence, you need proof beyond reasonable doubt.
And how does substantial evidence compare with proof beyond reasonable doubt?
You only need to have a reasonable piece of evidence that will support a reasonable mind. So we presume everyone's reasonable enough, especially justices of the Court of Appeals.
And so the petition was found lacking substantial evidence because it's unreasonable?
Yes. Substantial evidence is as if we present a labor complaint, we will not actually win in a labor complaint.
What exactly was unreasonable about your argument?
So the Court of Appeals held that there was no substantial evidence. There was no substantial evidence to support our contention, our allegation that the COMELEC is actually using intelligence funds against our petitioners.
Yeah, that's so weird because intelligence funds, for those of you who don't know, that's already what we call pre-liquidated, meaning you don't need receipts. You don't need to demonstrate exactly how you've spent that money. At least that's how it used to be when that was first created maybe 15 years ago in the Arroyo government. No, is that any different now, Gilbert?
Well, it's almost unliquidated actually. And what's so interesting is that, in fact, one of our pieces of evidence was the admission itself of the deputy spokesperson in a press release that they're actually using these intelligence funds. In fact, the COMELEC chair himself stated that they're using these intelligence funds against alleged saboteurs, electoral saboteurs. They will use this to file criminal complaints. So
Wait,
it was
sorry.
actually
One of the questions was that is this not even auditable by the Commission on Audit?
well, technically, it should still be audited by the
But
COA. It should still be under audit. Nothing should be outside of the ambit of the auditing powers of the COA, except that for practical reasons, they just lump sum it na, yeah, we've actually used it.
right, so they can still audit the total, but they can't audit the line items in it, right?
Yes, the line items.
Gilbert, you have another case to talk about, or like I see you got maybe 2 more slides.
Actually, we appealed this to the Supreme Court, but unfortunately, the Supreme Court also did not grant our appeal. So it's so interesting that in Habeas Data, you actually need the lowest level of evidence, and yet it's so difficult for courts. It's as if courts are actually very conservative when it comes to granting habeas data. That's why I'd like to relate this to the war of drugs. Actually, in the war of drugs, there's just massive collection of personal information with respect to suspects of the drug trade. And it's really at the village level, at the barangay level. So that's the dossier collection at the village level. So at some point, we were thinking, should we actually file a habeas data against this collection of personal information against supposed drug addicts? But because of our experience, we actually thought of rather filing a petition for the Writ of Amparo, because we think that the Writ of Amparo has more remedies available. And
Sorry, what is the Writ of Amparo?
Yeah, the Writ of Amparo, literally it's protection. Amparo is protection. So if one feels that there's a threat to his right to life, liberty, or security, one should file a Writ of Amparo. So if you feel that someone is tailing you or you're being encased, the Writ of Amparo is actually the right remedy. So,
Gilbert,
yes.
I have a question on habeas data in relation to Amparo. No? So, and I think we'll make this the last point before we move on to the last presentation, if you don't mind. No?
Mm-hmm.
How effective has the writ of habeas data been since its creation in the mid-2000s? No, like we now, especially now that data is a very important sort of commodity, and it's a very sexy thing to talk about data now, and it's also a very important topic: data privacy, data security. How protected are we with this new, well, relatively new writ?
Well, I think there are mixed results when it comes to habeas data, because if I look at the news reports, there's actually been more of denials rather than granting of petitions for habeas data. For example, there's also this group, the National Union of People's Lawyers. Their petition for habeas data was also denied by the Court of Appeals, based on the same arguments, based on the same grounds that we had, that there was no substantial evidence to show that this administration is actually making surveillance over the NUPL lawyers. So
no one can prove, no one can seem to prove that they're being surveilled, because
yes, that's really the problem, because it's really snooping on the snoopers, spying on the spies. So how can you spy on the spies when in fact this is the state who are the spies?
Watchmen, right?
So you're trying to be a James Bond against James Bond. So that's really the challenge. How can you
show substantial proof that they're spying on you? But
yes.
Okay.
Even their admissions are not being used by the courts.
I think it's about time that maybe Justice Puno, retired Justice Puno, should come back to the table and maybe make some recommendations on how to improve this writ. No, especially now that we talk about being in the fourth industrial revolution and the age of data, and wow, this is probably the only thing we really have in the rules of court, in the rules of our Supreme Court, no, that that really helps us in terms of data and surveillance. Gilbert, we'll probably get back to your last few slides, if you don't mind.
Yes.
To give
Actually, that was the last. This is the last slide. SC
okay.
chunks our plea, our appeal.
Okay. All right. So thanks, Gilbert. Carlo, you
My
got
pleasure.
Yep. Sorry. And I'm going to try to take just 15 more minutes of your time before we go into discussions. Obviously, if you have other things to do tonight, let us know. But also wanted to apologize to Zumretay. Thank you for coming tonight. We did not expect, well, we kind of expected some dissidence from what you were saying. We actually tried to get as much information about people before signing up to this. But sorry for that. And, I realized that I did not apologize to you before being angry at the other person. But really appreciate what you have to say, because it's such an important lesson for so many people, either now or in the future. I'm going to present something, I think.
For everyone, don't forget to chime in with your questions. There's a Google Doc link on the chat.
How do I present?
And this is going to be a recorded podcast, no? So Zumretay and Gilbert, I think the stuff that you've talked about, you've shared, yeah, there's still a bigger audience waiting to hear this later on. So thanks for chiming in with us. Carlo, go ahead.
All right. So I'm going to try to go through this quickly because I realize it's 9 o'clock Philippine time. Should be full screen. So thanks again for coming tonight. This is, it's kind of a really important subject matter to me, surveillance and AI, just because I got into data science and artificial intelligence because I found out how much I could learn about other people, right? But that's from being an early developer in Facebook apps, and I realized how much data Facebook gave me, and then I realized how much data was out there about people, right? So this is a quote from this woman, Robin Morgan, who's a political activist in the US. She says, "Knowledge is power, information is power. The secreting or hoarding of knowledge or information may be an act of tyranny or camouflaged as humility." And I think this is so relevant to what's happening all over the world right now, not just the Philippines, right? Not just China, not just the US. In today's news, or I guess 3 days ago, there's an app being installed right now in Singapore that's being pushed out, tracking people's exposure to the COVID crisis, right? And I think it means well, and most of these things mean well in the beginning, but it could be turned into something worse. This morning, South China Morning Post reported that US cybersecurity experts see a spike in Chinese digital espionage. And kind of just want to go through a little bit of this, right? There's a bit of a history of surveillance in the Philippines. And it's not just China, it's also the US, right? And I think it's actually becoming a big problem. The US is selling a bunch of surveillance drones all over the region. The UK is also selling video surveillance programs. And that's been used towards the extrajudicial killings, allegedly. And, in November 22, 2019, which is a Friday afternoon at 6:21 p.m., they announced that the local government launched a Chinese CCTV surveillance system in Metro Manila, right? And to Zumretay's point, it started off as Hikvision. It's actually Huawei, which is a little bit more dangerous than Hikvision. But essentially, all of these cameras have facial recognition capabilities in Metro Manila. In this story, they tell you that it's in all cities except for Taguig and Makati, which is probably where most of the foreign embassies are. And I don't know if they're there yet still. Part of the problem is that it's getting really cheap to get surveillance systems. And a lot of companies around the world are realizing that they could sell a lot of surveillance and monitoring and invasive systems to small countries all over the world, right? So like the Philippines, for example. So remember a couple of months ago when it was reported by the Washington Post that Jeff Bezos had his phone hacked through WhatsApp, and that was through an Israeli company called NSO Group. Basically, what happened was that they traced it back to Mohammed bin Salman, who's the crown prince of Saudi Arabia. He sent a file to Jeff Bezos on WhatsApp that he bought through NSO Group, and that was able to hack through Jeff Bezos' phone. And for all intents and purposes, pretty much Jeff Bezos is the richest person in the world, right? So if he can't protect against hacks, most of us can't probably either. In 2013, this kind of came into fruition with this guy, Edward Snowden, former NSA and CIA consultant with Booz Allen Hamilton. Basically, he left and started whistleblowing a lot of things that the USA was doing. And what the USA was doing was basically they created this program called the PRISM program. They gathered all of the data they could get through US companies and then centralized it towards NSA, CIA programs, right? And there's a lot to be said about what China is doing right now. But when you think about how big Facebook is, for example, MAU means monthly active users. In Q3 of 2012, Facebook got to 1 billion users. In Q1 of 2017, they got to 2 billion users. And for reference, China right now is at maybe around 1.4 billion people, and up to 2019 November, Facebook was already at 2.5 billion people. So if you're looking at how much data the NSA has collected on people, it's not just on Americans, right? The American population is about 370 million people, which means that they've collected so much data on everyone else. When you look at Google and specifically just YouTube, they got to 2 billion people in May 2019. They don't actually publish how many people they reach on the search engine because, there's a lot of reasons why, but that's probably way more than 2 billion people every month, right? Now, to Zumretay's point, the iJob has been building a database of people in East Turkestan and other places in China to be able to police people, plus also build up the social credit scoring, right? And they collect everything from your location, your phone number, your blood type, everything that Zumretay already showed earlier. And it should scare everybody because China has been really good at this. They've showed that they can do this. They have the capacity for it. They have the technical ability for it. They have the will to do it. And then also the US is also trying to do this, right? So Amazon created a facial recognition system that also did emotional recognition. And this is a video or a GIF of them showing that they could find fear in somebody's face, which is pretty useless for a lot of e-commerce stuff, right? But very useful for a lot of war level stuff. The worst part about it is that it's not that accurate, right? And a lot of these facial recognition systems are not that accurate, but it works to their advantage. You just have to convince your population that you have facial recognition to be able to scare them into submission, right? And that's a bigger problem. And a lot of bad uses of facial recognition, right? And actually, I haven't actually seen a good use of facial recognition yet. So there was this professor who did this facial recognition study to tell if you were gay. Lots of problems with this. One, the very basic problem is like, why would you do this? What use would you have for this? Two, it wasn't that accurate because he only traded on white men. But you know, the future, right? Or the future is already here. So it's mostly computers, right? So that means that like you can control it, you can collect data on it, and it's not as secure as you want it to be. So there's a push towards digital pills, and this is what the future and present looks like. In 2018, the FDA in the US passed this digital pill where you could just take it and it does a diagnostic for you. And with that diagnostic, it tells you on an app what's happening in your body, if that person has taken medicine or not, and does a diagnosis. Also in 2018, I think there was this guy who made a artificial pancreas for his daughter that gave him notifications on Bluetooth because she was diabetic, so he would know when to give her insulin. Really good use for all of that, but also lots of security risk, because what if I had a mailing list, if I were a hacker, if I had a mailing list of all the people who had artificial pancreas, and they're starting to make this commercial now. If I had a list of all of these people, I could just email them and tell them, you know, if you don't give me whatever, 20 Bitcoin, I'll turn off your artificial pancreas, right? And you could say this with like, you could abstract this to every other artificial part of a body, whether it's a person's arm, a hand, or if they have a pacemaker in their heart. If they get an email saying that they could just turn it off, would you risk it? I wouldn't, right? One of the biggest...
During an era in which our enemies can make it look like anyone is saying anything at any point in time.
One of the biggest threats.
Even if they would never say those things. So, for instance, they could have me say things like, I don't know, Killmonger was right. Or Ben Carson is in the sunken place. Or, how about this? Simply, President Trump is a total and complete dipshit.
Okay, so that's an example of I don't know if you heard all of that, but that was an example of a deepfake, which is using AI to put somebody's words into somebody else's video, right? You could change somebody's face and everything they're saying into what you want them to say. And that's done with AI. It's gotten pretty cheap. I think the cheapest I found was $20 an hour online. But if you wanted to make it yourself, if you had the skills, you could do it. And then one of the biggest problems too is that, you know, someone's figured out the mother of all rebrands, right? So they've started to put a surveillance state, what we usually call a surveillance state, into this new term called a smart city, right? And who doesn't want a smart city? Every city is stupid, right? But who doesn't want a smart city? But basically what a smart city means is that there's always sensors all day long watching everything everyone is doing. Great rebranding, and I like it as an entrepreneur, but terrible for human rights and for freedom, freedom meaning free will, right? For us feeling like we have the choice to do what we want to do. And this is how it's starting to get rebranded by China, by the US, by a lot of other countries, pushing their products all over the world. Locally, very popular mayor, Isko Moreno, who's the mayor of Manila City. They recently installed facial recognition cameras in the city of Manila. And his quote, I'll just translate it because my Tagalog's awful. But basically he says, for every criminal who has records, you're not allowed in Manila, right? So basically what he's saying is, one, he wants to collect points on facial recognition and being able to protect people from crime. Two, he's saying that he doesn't believe in criminal reform, right? He doesn't believe that you can pay your due to society. And three, he believes in the justice system all the way, which is, maybe at best 70% right in every country ever, right? And that's kind of one of the problems, right? Because companies are selling their facial recognition system, facial recognition CCTV systems to manage the country because they say it will solve crime. When there are 215,000 prisoners in the Philippines, that's 0.197% of the population, right? 75% of those people are still waiting for trial, meaning they're not all guilty, they're just in prison. So how big of a problem is it really that they're solving? And the problem with most camera systems is that they're assuming that everyone is going to be a criminal at some point. Meaning they're capturing our facial data, our movement data, all of that stuff. And when it comes down to it, every government at every point in time who had a lot of data did something badly with it, right? So these are Hollerith machines, which was made by the Third Reich in Germany to capture all of the data for all of the Jews and all the dissidents and all the people who were opposing the Third Reich. And they digitized it, or not digitized, because they put it all in one database so that when Hitler came into power or had enough power, he would be able to gather them a lot faster through the surveys. And this is kind of the history of humanity, right? If we give people too much information, we give people too much power, they will do something bad with it. And I think, sorry, I'll go to the end of that. And the collection of data, the surveillance data, all of that stuff is just one part of the problem. The other part of that problem, maybe the bigger part of that problem, is that once you have all of that data, you have a responsibility to secure it. You can't collect all that data and then just have everyone else kind of hack you, right? And for 2 years in a row, Philippines has ranked badly in like a lot of different indexes for cybersecurity, because we don't have the skill set for it yet, right? There's a few people who can do it, but it hasn't scaled yet. And we're starting to collect data, we're starting to make software for our industries here, which just means that we have more of a responsibility. And love to get Attorney Gilbert's thoughts on the Data Privacy Act. But the biggest example of that is the Common Leak, where Common Leak, which is the Commission for Elections. Sorry, I'm new to the Philippines. Moved away when I was 10, back a couple of years. But Commission on Elections, they had a really bad password for their database, and someone hacked it and released 78 million people's data in 2016, which included like fingerprint data, obviously like voting history, demographic information. And it's not just China, right? The US has also shown that they have the will, they have the malice, they have the interest in pursuing other people's data all over the world. Like, why would you have to make your own Facebook if you could just hack Facebook? Is essentially what the CIA and the NSA is kind of doing, according to Snowden and a few other people, right? But also, it's also China, right? And China has shown such discipline and and if I wasn't so into human rights, one of the best hacks ever was that China hacked the supply chain, meaning that they made this tiny microchip that they gave to Apple and I think Amazon and Intuit or somebody. And basically they gave this microchip to them and waited a few years to activate it, meaning that if you've ever played a game, you're basically given God mode, right? They were able to access all of everything built on top of it because they were at such a fundamental level of it. And it was mentioned earlier, social credit score in China, pretty terrible because it basically like forces you to be a good citizen to their degree. And this is how China is kind of doing it. And the green on top is how the data they're collecting, the orange on the bottom is what you can do or not do, right? But it's not just China. The US is actually doing this, but it's more privatized, right? So In the US, the same things are applying to the FICO score. Facebook's collecting the same data. Google's collecting the same data. So if you're the CIA, the FBI, the NSA, you're basically just collating all of that so you don't have to make your own apps. The only difference is that China's making their own apps, right? And they're doing the same thing with it. And again, at the end of the day, knowledge is power, information is power. Hoarding information and data is not a good thing, and we should all be vigilant about it. And this is my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Carlo. Okay, should we just dive into the questions now? Does anyone wanna comment on Carlo's presentation? Right now we have 8 questions on the Google Doc. Should we? Okay, we'll go right to the first one now.
You want to share the doc while we're reading it?
Sige, sige. That's
So good for me being the observer this time around. I'm just seeing how concrete one of our aphorisms is turning out to be, which is data rights are human rights. And as we've seen with Zumretay's discussion and Attorney Gilbert's points about habeas data, doesn't seem to be obvious that society is ready to acknowledge data as a human right. Even now, even laws that have been passed around habeas data, Attorney Gilbert, right? Courts are reluctant to recognize that. So I think that's one insight I get immediately. There's this, I don't know, asymmetric view between the value of data. Either we value it too much to the point that we can't use it, or we don't value it at all, and you can't, and it's also bad if it's not valued at all.
I think in some point in the near future, maybe in the next 2 years, all of the officials in every country has officially become too old to understand what people can do with data and technology.
I think this is the challenge. There's an asymmetrical relationship in the sense that our courts are a bit conservative when it comes to state surveillance. But when it comes to private data collection, there's the Data Privacy Act. So I think that the government will be strict when it comes to data collection by private entities. So there will be a asymmetrical view of how data is and who is doing the data processing and gathering.
Yeah, that much is true. Nick, you want to run through some of the questions?
Yeah. Can you see the shared doc?
Yeah, you can see it.
All right. So first question, not addressed to anyone specifically. Can't really deny the progress China has made in terms of AI, but this was achieved at a very high cost, freedom mostly. Where and how do we draw the line as we pursue progress and advancement? So advancement in AI versus, I guess, deductions in freedom is maybe Zumretay, you'd like to weigh in on this one.
Yes, sure. I think it's pretty easy where we should draw the line, because I mean the state, obviously China is using this at targeting minorities, not only Uyghur people but other ethnic minorities as Tibetans, Kazakh, Kyrgyz, and also any kind of dissidents. So I think the line draws at when it's used against these people and targeted against them. I think this is where we should draw the line. And when these minorities or these people are facing reprisals, consequences from directly from the surveillance state, and whenever it is an intrusion to their privacy, I think this is where sending people home to their homes, this is a clear intrusion to their private life. I think, yeah, any time that there is a human rights violation, a violation of their basic human rights, this is where we draw the line, and we should draw the line.
Gilbert, the next one's for you, no? My question involved...
Yeah. Very interesting question, especially the COVID.
let me just read it out loud for everyone. No? The question involves data privacy in the middle of a pandemic. I see lots of people clamoring for DOH to reveal the location of people who tested positive. Where do you draw the line between data privacy and public safety? That is a good question.
Okay. Now, this involves really a tension between the right, the right to privacy and the right to health of the people, of the community. So where do we draw the line? I think the DOH has really played that balance well, in the sense that they don't reveal the names of these patients. They just say the number of these patients. Then they give a general idea of where these patients most probably stayed, and most probably had the great contact with other people. So, but not to state really, not to reveal the residence, for example, the specific barangay of this patient. So I think that's where we can give a balance when it comes to the right to privacy, the right to data, and the right to health. So never give so much specificity that you will actually identify. Even if you're a third party, you can identify. So just make it enough that friends will know. Because if you're actually in close relations with that person, with that patient, you will actually know, that's actually my friend. So you can now say whether you've been with that friend in the past 2 weeks. But not to the point that a third party can actually say, that's the person.
Someone's writing a follow-up to that, no? City mayor gives the breakdown per barangay. Is that enough? Is that enough privacy? Yes, it is. Doesn't reveal anyone, but
I think still enough. Still enough to the point that will actually give a leeway to that barangay to have a more enhanced community quarantine provision. So I think that's really the reason why they're giving the number of patients per barangay, so that they can determine whether or not they're still within the guidelines of the IATF, so that they can do a more enhanced quarantine with respect to the barangay. But not so much as to the street number, the residence number. That's really very intrusive already.
Okay. Let's jump to one for Carlo, no? And this is a question I've been meaning to ask for a long time. Is there a positive use case for, or positive uses for deepfakes? I know you flashed a slide there on deepfakes, particularly the one on Obama. Presumably someone proposed that research for something good at some point in the past, no? What are your thoughts on this, Carlo?
I think there are a lot of good uses for deepfakes. Unfortunately, the ones you can make money out of are not good uses of deepfakes, right? So for example, like let's say you wanted to read, or you were supposed to read, what's a book that everyone pretends to read? Like Dante's Inferno, right? So instead of reading it, you could just have Dante read it to you. No one actually knows what Dante looks like. No one knows what he sounds like. You could deepfake all of that. In the Philippines, you could say like, everyone pretends to read Nola Betangere or El Filibuster, but you could just have Rizal read it. You only know what one side of his face looks like. You could also use this for, I don't know, cutting down costs on production for movies or TV shows or commercials, right? Obviously, that means like I'm on the side of spending money. If you're an actor, that's not a good thing for you. Or you could get royalties on a lot more things based on your likeness. You could scale it more, but that almost never works.
Okay. And what are the negative use cases that you can enrich yourself with?
What do you mean by enrich, bro?
Zumretay, there's another one for you. Actually, you can pick between number 3 or number 7. Or maybe you should just go with number 5. Before the surveillance system of China being implemented, Xinjiang people. I suppose this is east. Okay, so the western province where the Uyghurs are from. People had been in the threat of terror. The threat of terrorism caused by extreme religious beliefs and political reasons. Similar activities of terrorism, just like in 9/11. So is it good for this kind of system of surveillance to be implemented to prevent bigger threats to the majority, or just focus on human rights and neglect the possible threats? Wow, this is a question we ask in almost any country, really.
Right.
So maybe you
yeah.
can tailor this to the situation of the Uyghurs specifically.
Of course. Yes. I think it's a valid and a legitimate question. And I mean, what happens, which the problem with China is that they, since 9/11, they kind of routinely use this narrative of terrorism to repress any kind of legitimate dissent. So whether it is, you know, Uyghurs or other people, other ethnic minorities, or just human rights defenders, they've, you know, especially if they're Muslim, obviously with the terrorism, they use this as a pretext, basically. And the fact that they're treating like an entire population as potential terrorists simply because of their ethnicity or religion is absolutely discriminatory. And this is a clear violation of their basic rights and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So this kind of logic or pretext just gives the floor to abuses and justify atrocities throughout, you know, China, like throughout history, basically. So the question is, why is it so much to just ask, like, you know, Chinese government to respect the basic rights of Uyghurs and give their freedoms and freedom of religion? Because like I said, from the leaks that came out recently, just for an Uyghur to grow a beard, that was considered as terrorist. And the multiple regulations they introduced, if you look at the counterterrorism law from 2016 or the de-extremification regulations that was introduced by China, all these laws, they have very vague terms, vague definitions of terrorism. So like it includes like people growing beards, people having more than 4 child, people wearing longer skirts. So, and now with what China is doing is forcing people to, you know, abandon all kinds of religious practices. So they're actually forcing people to, during Ramadan, to not fast. And they force people to drink alcohol, to sell alcohol, which is, you know, and eat pork. I mean, all these things that are, you know, legitimate beliefs in the Islam religion throughout the world, this is being targeted by China because of their so-called fight against terrorism. Is that justified? And like using all these surveillance methods to target this entire population in the name of terrorism, I think it's a clear abuse of their power.
Yeah, here in, I think the Muslim homeland here in the Philippines now, which is in the south, it's called the Bangsamoro region. One of the, yes. Of course, that's probably one of the most heavily surveilled areas in the whole country, no? Mostly because of porous maritime borders. Also, it's very easy for networks of terrorism to penetrate the country as well, no? And I don't have a clear opinion about a comparison between how heavily they're surveilled compared to other minority Muslim populations around the world, no? But yeah, there certainly is some sort of delicate balance that has to be made.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if you just like add something quickly.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I mean, China claiming that they're fighting against terrorism, if that was like their legitimate and true purpose, why would they lie about, you know, this like existence of crackdown on their religious freedom? And why would they not give any information, no statistics, names, or anyone who's detaining these camps? Why not allow independent observers from the UN or other parties to go and assess the situation? And why, you know, this is the whole denial around it is kind of suspicious. And if we kind of give away our right for this illusion of security and stability, I think we're heading towards authoritarianism and pure dystopia.
Well, that sure sounds like our playbook right now in this government. Not opening.
No comment. But can I add something real quick?
No comment on that one. Okay, go on. Carlo, go ahead.
Follow-up question to that. You know, in July 2009, it was really, I was in the US starting my one of my companies, and you know, really, you know, in the middle of a financial crisis. But I remember the story in Urumqi, right? What was that about Urumqi that alarmed the Chinese government, right? Because that was only there's an uprising of 1,000 people, right? In the grand scheme of things, 1,000 people everywhere in the world, especially in China, is not that many people, right? What was it about that actually triggered more surveillance and more heavy-handedness for the Chinese government?
I think it's because, I don't know, maybe for the first time, I think China kind of, well, the government realized that the Uyghur people were actually fed up, because before 2009, I remember, like, it was pretty smooth considering like the situation now. And I was actually born there, and I was there until 2003, and like it was smooth. And I think 2009 was really a turning point, because it was the first time in years that the Uyghur population really stood up together against this injustice and against this repressive government. And there was this huge kind of feeling of solidarity among the Uyghurs. And they kind of, I think they were scared that this would degenerate and bring more problems, and especially considering their Belt and Road Initiative program that's been, you know, undergoing. They wanted to really firm up and like take control over the region, and really implement restrictive measures to control the population, to avoid future like uprisings or any kind of problems that would bring the attention of the international community in the region. Because obviously this region is a key part of their project of Belt and Road Initiative. So I think this was like the turning point for them to realize that it might go out of their hands if they don't control it tightly.
If you have time for another call some other day, we could go through the whole Belt and Road Initiative in China, because
yeah, that's another.
That's a whole other thing. What's the next question, Nick?
Maybe Gilbert will ask you one last before your wife asks you to come back to bed. Yeah, to me, as someone who works in the field of data analytics, now this is actually a very interesting question. Number 4, in legalese, substantial evidence, reasonable doubt, maybe probable cause also, and there's an entire hierarchy of what do you call it? The quantum of evidence, as you call it, no. To non-lawyers, especially to data professionals, is there a way that these differences can be quantified?
Very interesting, because in fact, it uses quantum of evidence, which is actually also a physics term, and I was a former physics major.
Yes.
Well, it's not quantifiable in the sense of, in the mathematical sense, but it's quantifiable in the logical sense. So it really guides our sense of logic. What is enough for us if we are dealing with a case? So if it's a criminal case, it's the most difficult evidence, because if there's reasonable doubt, then it will not be enough to convict a person.
But what's the
there's
number
reasonable
for
doubt.
reasonable doubt?
So,
If it were a number,
but
like, how many reasons do I have to list down and then I have doubt?
in fact, there's a movie about it that they were listing the reasonable doubts that they had, and they said the jury said, he's not guilty. Because in essence, in a criminal case, there's actually a constitutional
movie?
presumption. Of
Which movie was that? Sorry.
12 Angry Men.
Yes, that's what I was
12
thinking.
Angry Men. Watch it.
That's a classic. That's
Very
a
illustrative. So, in fact, there's a constitutional presumption, the innocence of the accused. So, the state must first move beyond that before a person can be convicted. But in a civil case, since these are private individuals, the quantum of evidence is really preponderance. Meaning to say, who has the weightier evidence? So, if someone has the weightier evidence, that person wins.
Like,
But in some,
more arguments,
yeah,
more
more pieces of evidence,
more evidence. Okay.
the testimony, the witnesses are more credible because you may have more witnesses, but your witnesses are not credible. So it's also an issue of credibility. And substantial evidence, really, you're not going against a presumption. You're not going against another person. You're just using your reasonableness. So it's really the lowest. It's really the lowest.
I have a question about, since you have a science background. For those of you who don't know Gilbert, which is probably everybody except me. Yeah, Gilbert's he's from Philippine Science. He said he's a physics major. Doesn't the physicist in you like revolt whenever you're looking at quantum of evidence? Like,
I actually
all this
I
precision.
become happy. I'm reminded of my former life. Because honestly, I think I actually demoted myself when I became a lawyer. Personal joke.
no disagreement. Sorry.
I think you're the only lawyer in here, so go ahead. Maybe Carlo, let's do a time check now. It's 9:39. This is probably one of the longer episodes we've had.
I mean, maybe. I'm happy to answer the other questions. We could also let everyone go if they want to sleep. Or
we do have a nice sizable crowd right now at wow, 13. We still have 13 people on board. And
can I just say that, like, if anyone's friends with that guy who was talking earlier, you all know who I'm talking about. If he wants to reach out to me so we could have a conversation, just look at my website, zerosixer.com, ZEROSIXER.com, and you could just email me. So I'm assuming he has some friends here, or not, but let's have a conversation because I'm happy to.
Is he from the Philippines? Or
I don't
to
know.
reach out to you, Carlo.
I'm not sure.
What?
To reach out to you, you're saying, okay.
Yeah,
and
just reach out to me, please. I'm not saying it's going to be conducive to good behavior, but
it's okay. There's social distancing now, so at least we know it's not going to get physical.
also emotional distancing. So.
So those of you who are still here, like Alan and Zishi, Raleigh, who's been here right from the beginning of the call, Gabriel, Len. I saw my wife earlier, but now she's disappeared. Maybe she doesn't find it. Thanks for joining us tonight. And Zumretay and Gilbert, thanks for being our resource persons tonight.
Our pleasure.
Very, very interesting presentations tonight. I think the topic of Uyghurs, as Carlo had mentioned, isn't very well developed here in local conversations. Yes. And
I think we have bigger fights maybe in the Philippines at the moment.
Bigger fights. That guy didn't sound like he was from here though.
No, but the problem is it's in the realm of possibilities for the Philippines, right?
Yeah.
So
I didn't think that anyone would have any strong feelings about the issue of Uyghurs, but yeah. And to Gilbert, like I said, in a private conversation with him a couple of days back, Habeas Data is probably something very alien to data professionals. And I'm glad that this is probably our first real conversation about the protections that we have in relation to the state and data on its citizens.
There's a really good book about habeas data all over the world called Habeas Data by I think it's a Wall Street Journal journalist. But really good book.
Yeah, don't put the pirate link here, Carlo. But yeah, I can look for that. We do know that habeas data, of course, has a legal tradition outside of the country, and Latin America is probably one of the most developed, innovative legal, what do you call this, discourses around the world, no? And I'm pretty sure we lifted it from there, no? Gilbert, I think maybe in the future we'll probably ask you to join us again on talking about the Comelec leak. When we get into data security and the problems that we have with the country being wholly unprepared really for protecting privacy in the age of data. So looking forward to another conversation with you at some point, or at least joining us in another podcast. Carlo, Doc, anything else to add to the conversation tonight?
No, it was awesome. I think it's going to take time to, I mean, in all of our podcasts, it always takes time to unpack all the insights. I think if there's one thing that I want to throw in before saying goodbye is, you know, where the legal perspective is right now, obviously is getting, if it hasn't been already, it's going to get disrupted because more and more our lives are getting quantified, and maybe the last frontier is really criminal cases and justice. And I don't know if I personally want to go that far and have everything really quantified to the nth degree, right? But if you look elsewhere, I was telling Nick and Carlo this before we started, everywhere else, your life is already quantified. Whenever you apply for a credit card, whenever you shop on Amazon and eBay, it's pure mathematics that determine what price you pay, what recommendations you get. And we seem to be comfortable with that. And that's also another thing I wanted to highlight. We seem to be, and I'm going to oversimplify, we seem to be happy surrendering personal rights, let's say on social media, if it will result in personal conveniences. So, I get my feed tailored to me, and, I get to see what my friends are doing. We agree for Facebook and YouTube and Google to curate that, and we let go of our privacy to do that. But in COVID-19, we're a bit uneasy to have other people's rights trampled upon for my safety, So it's another one of those asymmetries we need to unpack. Because if you look at them really side by side, it's pretty much the same thing, right? You want to let go of privacy so that it benefits people. But we're already doing it to ourselves, on social media. So I just found that very glaring. It's going to take time to unpack.
Yeah, hope we have more of these conversations, and to just end this all. I hope that this conversation, you learn something from everybody or somebody, at least one thing from somebody, and that you learn that these are tough conversations. When we talk about data and ethics, this is uncharted territory, literally, right? So hope you can find a way to have conversations with this when it doesn't feel right to you. A lot of the questions today was about when are you supposed to do this? When are you supposed to bring this up? And for me, it's always been when I'm not comfortable with the conversation. I'm always going to bring it up. And hopefully this gives you more information and a little bit more will to do this. But thank you, Attorney Gilbert. I don't know what you do, but counsel Zumretay. But, thanks.
Advocacy Manager.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zumretay. Thank you, Attorney Gilbert. Thank you, Carlo.
Thanks, everyone.